It's funny because this is such a key question and I don't have an answer. At least I don't have a nice, neat answer.
I think what I aim for student learning is sort of breaking down barriers and for understanding the different perspectives of different peoples and different ways of life and how Indigenous culture may be different from European culture.
We have a tendency to focus on a Eurocentric worldview. And it is important for us to have a much more global perspective on things.
I don't use it so much myself with students, particularly when I'm talking with engineers, because engineers are, in general, they don't have that background and they may not necessarily see how that practically applies to nowadays because they're thinking about, well, colonialism is something in the past and so why are you talking about it?
I struggle with the question of, or the difference between decolonization and indigenization. For me, it's been a journey simply through decanonization of our music history curriculum teaches a very fixed canon. But I don't think you can indigenize anything without first being aware of decolonization. But something that I've come to a fairly recent realization is that we can't even talk about decolonization until we look at colonialism and coloniality and how that's embedded in so many things we do.
Sometimes that looks like learning about the history of how people have come to live together and often not very well on this land. And sometimes that looks like drawing students' attention to the structures in which our education is playing out.
We're probably not specifically trying to decide whether or not what is happening today is continuing colonialism or not. We're just looking at, well, what are some of the effects and how to understand what is there at the moment.
You know, I'm a settler. I was born and raised on unceded Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territory in what is now Vancouver. And I learned very, very little about the history of colonization. I learned very little about Indigenous people. I had no idea whose land I lived on. I had no idea that it was unceded, but I knew that there was a Musqueam reserve 10 minutes from my house. And I knew that there were houses that were right next to the reserve that non-Indigenous people lived in. And I had no idea about the history of where I lived, but I knew that there was something very different about the people who lived on the reserve. And I knew that there was something different about them and they had different things and different way of life, but I had no idea who they were. And it was just a very separate kind of thing. And I also didn't know that the reasons why my family was prospering on land that was stolen had a lot to do with the fact that they were able to buy and sell that land without any regard for its value for the people who had lived there for thousands of years. And yet my social milieu, like that of many settler Canadians, involved disparaging and looking down on Indigenous people for not having what we had, when in fact what we have is theirs. So I've learned over many years of learning and listening that helping my students to situate their own family's relationship to land and to property and to wealth is integral to being way more humble about differences in things like socioeconomic status and educational attainment and income and occupation. That there is no way that it makes sense to actually look down on Indigenous people when you actually understand what has happened and what has been done and how that has tremendously benefited me and not like against every possible best interest of Indigenous people.
It's important to get the students to question their assumptions, to learn about this narrative and where it came from, the context of who makes it into the narrative, who's marginalized, and what stories are completely erased. Too often we teach music history, traditionally we teach music history as a narrative, a bunch of dates and composers and masterworks. And it's too easy to start thinking that decolonization just has nothing to do with art music. or that is work that somebody else has to do. And certainly we teach critical thinking and so on, but all the critical thinking and critical writing then takes place within that framework. And if you don't question the framework and question the assumptions, you can never move. It's like the fish is unaware of the water. And indeed the whole, the academy itself is a colonial institution. So I think perhaps critiquing the entire university is a bit much for undergraduate students, but we can certainly encourage them to critique what they are learning at the moment.
It's extremely important to tell the truth about what has led us to this place and how education has been involved in that, and then to engage students in thinking, well, we benefit from something that's pretty terrible, so what do we do now?
Mahatma Gandhi is definitely a relevant figure. His idea of a non-violent protest was adopted by, for example, people like Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. And his entire philosophy is based on what's called satyagraha, which means holding on to truth. In this modern world where, we have sacrificed truth for profit, rather,
I might talk about cross-cultural understanding and respect, etc. And I do recognize how that probably fits into colonialism theory and how it is breaking down those barriers.
Science is a collective endeavor. It's an endeavor of the entire human race has been involved in it. And it's the same thing with the humanities. The human being is not one particular, culture. The human being is a very global figure, and lots and lots of cultures, lots and lots of different countries, different traditions have grappled with the same problems of the human being. And it's interesting to see how they approach these problems and what the thought was. And so I think that would be a kind of a more decolonizing view of these topics.
The course where I do a lot of Indigenous Aboriginal issues is a graduate course. And we do have a lot of international students. So I have seen connections there, particularly where some of the international students are coming from former colonies, etc., as well. And I have noticed students reflecting upon their own experience and the way things are in their own country because of colonialism and where their country is now, and relating to some of the Indigenous issues because of that. So I've also learned from the students about perhaps the relevance of the colonial framework for understanding it.
I'm always reminded of the very seminal article by Tuck and Yang called Decolonization Is Not a Metaphor. And one of their main points is that really decolonization is about giving back and recognizing what has been stolen and taken. It's not a metaphor for all of the other wonderful things we'd love to do in our courses. So getting rid of hierarchies, encouraging discussion and so on are all great things, but they may or may not have anything to do with decolonization.
Talking about whose land we are on, whether it is ceded or unceded, talking about myself sort of as a settler, talking about my family's arrival, and the sort of saying like this land has not always been called this is not how things have always been, this is fairly new. So everyday minor language practices that just remind our students and make it a norm of the learning space that this is a colonized context.
Realizing that the wealth that funded the the palaces, the churches, the concert halls, the marvelous architecture that's there that we look at from the 17th and 18th century, that this wealth that flowed into Europe at that time came from stolen goods from the other parts of the world.
Well, I think what has been most effective have been experiential learning opportunities that we've done in the course. And the first thing we do is the Kairos blanket exercise and then some discussion afterwards. So that's a very participatory thing and a visual representation of what happened to Indigenous peoples in North America. So that sort of is a good way of sort of engaging people who may not have thought about this at all previously.
It is very hard for people to have sort of an opinion-centered dialogue about colonization when you are reading primary source documents that guided the implementation of genocidal policies on behalf of the Canadian government. It is very hard to recenter your own opinion and difficult feelings as a settler about being asked to participate in reconciliation when you are confronted with truth. So that is a very useful thing, is to engage students in reading the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and in observing how Indigenous people were constructed by the Crown and constructed in that document as sovereign nations. And then thinking about what does it look like when nations engage with each other today? What are some structures we have in which nations engage with each other? And then let's think about all these different ways that we have data on how things are going for settlers here versus how they're going for Indigenous people, and these frameworks that are used, things like the Indian Act. And then does this actually reflect nation-to-nation negotiation?
I think bringing that kind of global endeavor, each culture, each nation contributing a part to the bigger picture, reinforces the idea that the pursuit of knowledge is a collective endeavor, and that maybe the students now can also contribute to this search for, the grander truth.
So I want to open these doors for my students. Whether or not they take the ideas, at least they've heard about them and heard and grappled a little bit with this question of where this history came from.
Teaching about Indigenous issues and perspectives is extremely generative for our students because it teaches them to have an epistemological sophistication. So there's really no better way to think about teaching about knowledge and how knowledge is made and how knowledge is produced and what the strength is of a knowledge claim versus an opinion claim and what those differences are and how those are different, and how people think about that changes. There's really no better and more timely way to teach about that than to teach about Indigenous ways of knowing and to teach about things like cultural appropriation and whose knowledge counts to make a moral claim about a practice being correct or not. So engaging those questions and those issues that are very prevalent in society is an excellent way to teach about different kinds of Indigenous ways of knowing, while also helping our students to be much more sophisticated in the way of thinking about knowledge and what counts as knowledge and what knowledge can do and can't.
The emphasis on the course that I'm doing is about potentially working with Indigenous communities, but also have some of the same principles, because it's mainly about respect and understanding and asking questions rather than just saying, well, we know what's right or what's best, and to understand that people are going to be coming at issues from a different perspective, and to be open to understanding that can be translated into many different contexts.
Learning and teaching is a two-way process, and as much as these students are learning things, I'm also learning things. And I think that's a really energizing experience.
When I have to do sort of this is what happened 101 with my students, it's very heavy, but I also have a moment when I say, like, this is not your fault, right? So sometimes I even use different kind of like affect-based teaching strategies, and I actually get them to say that, right? Like, this is not my fault. I did not do this, but this is my responsibility. Yes, you are having feelings. We are going to talk about that, and acknowledge that, but that will not be why we're here and why we're talking about this. Let's figure out something we can do.